Nora Winslow's tires hummed over the fog-soaked bridge, her headlights slicing through the gray like blades through wet silk. 5:12 a.m. Old Pike Bridge. The sea wind roared beneath her, cold enough to bite through steel. She should have been halfway to the marina by now. Then she saw it. A German shepherd, dark as a shadow, standing perfectly still in the center of the bridge. Not scared, just waiting in the swirling mist. The sound that followed wasn't a growl or bark. It was a plea, raw and trembling, almost human. Why is it here? What made it so badly injured? Follow along to see how the story ends and what you learn from such stories. A cold marine fog blanketed Clearwater Bay, soft and pale, swallowing the world before sunrise. Eleonora Nora Winslow gripped the steering wheel of her aging rescue truck as she crossed the iron span of Old Pike Bridge, her headlights slicing through the mist like twin spears. At 41, Nora carried the kind of tired grace found in people who had survived storms, both literal and personal. She was tall and slender, with long limbs shaped by years of hauling ropes, climbing rigging, and dragging half-conscious sailors from shattered docks. Her skin carried the faint bronze of someone who worked outdoors, though the salty wind had roughened its edges. Loose waves of chestnut-brown hair were tied in a low knot at the nape of her neck, strands escaping to brush against a jawline sharp enough to suggest the stubbornness beneath. Her eyes, a muted gray blue, held the distant look of someone who had once trusted the world more than she does now. She had learned caution not from books, but from loss. A boating accident 3 years earlier had taken her younger brother Rowan, the only person who ever managed to pull genuine laughter out of her. Since then, Nora had shifted into a version of herself, trimmed down to essentials: work, solitude, stillness, and a fierce, quiet competence that anchored her on even the darkest nights. The bridge rattled softly under her tires as a gust of wind blew across the bay. In Clearwater, February fog didn't simply float above the water, it smothered everything, swallowing color, sound, and distance. Nora leaned forward in her seat, narrowing her eyes as the mist swirled thicker. Then she saw movement, a dark blur crossing the white wash of her headlights. She slammed the brakes hard enough that the truck fishtailed before grumbling to a halt. Standing directly in front of her was a German shepherd, adult, tall, and striking in the gloom. Its coat was a deep black mixed with burnt umber along the legs and chest, wet from fog and sea spray. Its ribs showed faintly beneath its fur, suggesting hunger, hardship, or both. The dog didn't bark or snarl. Instead, it released a low, trembling whine, a sound too desperate, too human to ignore. Nora lowered her window slowly. "Hey, buddy. Easy," she murmured, her voice steadier than the pulse hammering beneath her ribs. She had seen frightened animals before. As a coastal rescue technician, she'd reached down into storm drains for whimpering puppies and waded chest-deep into freezing surf to save strays caught in tidal pulls. But this was different. This dog wasn't scared. It was pleading. When Nora stepped out, cold air knifed through her jacket. The shepherd approached with surprising gentleness, placing one paw against her knee before tugging the hem of her coat. The pull was not a bite or command. It was a request. "Show me," she whispered. The dog trotted toward the right rail of the bridge, glancing back to ensure she followed. Nora's boots thudded across damp metal grates as she approached the edge where the fog dipped lower, curling upward as if hiding something. The shepherd's body trembled, not with fear, but urgency. When Nora looked down, she finally heard it, a faint, rhythmic squeak almost lost under the wind. Something was wedged between the lower support beams, a wooden crate no larger than a toolbox lodged precariously where the bridge met the rocky outcrop below. Nora knelt, gripping the rail tightly as she peered into the narrow gap. Inside the crate lay a tiny German shepherd pup, no more than 3 weeks old, shivering uncontrollably. Its fur was damp and patchy, clinging to its thin body like wet silk. Its eyelids fluttered, barely able to lift. "God," Nora whispered, breath catching, "you brought me to your baby." The mother dog lowered herself beside Nora, almost bowing, an animal gesture of trust so complete it pierced straight through the walls Nora had spent years constructing. The shepherd's amber eyes were wide with anguish, hope, and a strange steadiness that reminded Nora painfully of Rowan, how he used to look at her before stepping into a storm he wouldn't survive. Something inside her shifted, an old locked door creaking open. She reached toward the crate, testing the angle. It would be difficult. The metal beam was slick, slanted, and narrow. One wrong move and both she and the crate could slip into the churning water below. She inhaled, slow and firm, anchoring herself. "All right," she said softly, meeting the mother dog's gaze. "We're getting your pup out." The shepherd leaned close, touching its forehead briefly to Nora's shoulder, a gesture so gentle, so grateful, that Nora felt her chest constrict. She swallowed hard. "Stay with me," she whispered. Fog curled around them like a curtain as she prepared to climb down toward the crate, the mother dog watching her with a devotion so fierce it felt almost human. The morning fog thinned into drifting ribbons as Nora guided her rescue truck toward Windbreak Point, the sea wind growing sharper with each turn up the cliffside road. She kept glancing toward the passenger seat, where the German shepherd mother lay curled protectively around her trembling pup. The mother dog's fur, now faintly dry, revealed marks Nora hadn't seen clearly on the bridge, thin pale scars tracking across her ribs, a circular burn near her flank, and a deep indentation across the neck where a chain must have once cut unforgivingly into her skin. Nora felt her jaw tighten, a rare spark of anger warming her chest in the cold morning air. These were not the wounds of accident or misfortune. These were the signatures of cruelty. Windbreak Point came into view, an isolated cliff where a single weather-beaten cedar cabin clung to the rocks like a survivor refusing to fall. It had once been meant for two people, Nora and her late husband Elias, a quiet carpenter with warm brown eyes and hands always smelling of pine shavings. Elias had died in the same boating accident that took Nora's brother Rowan. The sea had swallowed both men in one brutal night, leaving behind an empty cabin, an unlit fireplace, and a woman whose grief hardened into solitude. The house creaked softly as Nora pushed open the door, the scent of cold salt mixing with the faint memory of Elias's tools still hanging on the wall. She brought the mother dog and her pup inside, placing them gently onto the old braided rug by the hearth. With practiced hands, Nora lit the stove and retrieved a thick wool blanket from a chest tucked beneath the window. She wrapped the tiny pup, no more than 3 weeks old, in warm fabric and cupped it against her chest. The pup's fur was a lighter shade than its mother's, soft brown with patches of black that would likely darken as it grew older. Its breathing came in shallow hitches, a fragile rhythm that made Nora hold her own breath each time it wavered. "Easy, little one. Stay with us," she whispered, unable to ignore the way her voice trembled. The mother shepherd remained close, her body tense and eyes following every movement. Now that they were indoors, Nora could see her more clearly. Medium-sized but underweight, legs long but shaky, ears tattered at the edges as if torn by wire or rough terrain. She had the regal build of a pure German shepherd, but the years had worn her down. Nora softened her voice. "I'll call you Solace. And the little one?" She looked down at the pup, who had pressed its nose weakly against her collarbone. "Hollow, because you survived an emptiness most couldn't." Solace's tail thumped once, barely, but enough to make Nora's chest warm. A knock at the door startled them all. Solace immediately stepped in front of Nora, fur rising in a defensive bristle. "It's all right," Nora murmured, and opened the door to reveal Dr. Fenwick Hale. Fenwick was a tall, wiry man in his late 40s with sandy gray hair pulled into a short ponytail and a neatly trimmed beard that gave him an air of composed intelligence. His eyes were an earthy hazel, kind yet burdened by the things he'd seen in his years as a coastal veterinarian. Though he was naturally calm, there was always a tension in his shoulders, a remnant of the wildfire that had taken his childhood home and younger sister decades earlier. Since then, Fenwick had dedicated himself to saving creatures who had no voice. His khaki jacket was covered in smudges of fur and ointment, and a stethoscope dangled from his neck like a permanent accessory. "You sounded urgent on the phone," he said, stepping inside. "Where are they?" Nora motioned toward the rug. Solace growled softly but didn't lunge, watching Fenwick with wary intelligence. Fenwick knelt slowly, offering the back of his hand. "Easy, girl," he said gently. "I'm here to help." His voice, soft but steady, seemed to disarm her. Solace relaxed just enough for him to begin his examination. After several minutes of careful handling, Fenwick exhaled sharply, a sound between frustration and sorrow. "These injuries aren't accidental," he said. "Burn marks, old fractures, chain scarring. Someone treated her like an object, not a living creature." Nora felt her throat tighten. "So it's what I thought." Fenwick nodded grimly. "There's been talk around the docks about a group running an illegal dog training ring out near the abandoned freight pier. They breed shepherds and other large breeds for profit, discipline them with cruelty to make them aggressive or obedient." Nora glanced at Solace, who had lowered her head onto her paws, watching the pup in her arms. "She escaped," Nora whispered, "and she carried him with her." Fenwick rose to his feet, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Someone will come looking. Dogs like her are valuable to people who don't deserve them." He met Nora's gaze. "Be careful." Nora looked around her cabin, the worn furniture, the lonely walls, the unfinished woodworking projects Elias left behind, and something old stirred inside her, a memory of being needed, of belonging, of protecting someone smaller than herself. "I'm keeping them here," Nora said, her voice steady, "at least until they're strong. Solace trusted me enough to ask for help. I won't betray that." Fenwick gave a slow nod. "Then I'll come back tomorrow with supplies, and I'll contact Sheriff Boone," quietly. Hollow whimpered and Solace moved instantly, curling around mother and pup in a protective arc. Nora watched them, feeling something open inside her, a fragile, unexpected warmth she had not felt since Elias and Rowan were alive. The wind howled against the windows, but inside, for the first time in years, the house felt less empty. By early afternoon, the sky had dimmed to a dull slate, clouds drifting low and heavy as a light. Persistent rain tapped against the cabin windows. Nora moved quietly through the living room, her steps slow and careful so as not to disturb Solace and Hollow, resting by the hearth. The fire crackled weakly, filling the small room with a faint orange glow that softened the edges of the storm outside. Solace was finally sleeping, though uneasily, her ears twitching at every drop that struck the roof. Hollow curled tightly against her chest, released soft breaths that lifted and fell in nervous patterns. Nora had wrapped both in clean towels earlier, and now she knelt beside them, checking Hollow's temperature again, brushing her fingertips gently along Solace's scarred flank. The dog's muscles tensed beneath her touch, but there was trust there, a fragile, uncertain trust that felt too precious to mishandle. Outside, a low, rumbling engine stirred the silence. Nora froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the slow idle of a large vehicle coming to a stop. She rose, peering through the rain-beaded window that overlooked the twisting road up to Windbreak Point. There, at the base of the hill, sat a dark-colored truck, its silhouette barely visible through the mist and rainfall. The engine hummed quietly, headlights dimmed. It didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't attempt to approach. It simply waited. Nora felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck, a feeling she had known before during search and rescue operations where she sensed danger before seeing it. She stepped back from the window, heart knocking against her ribs. "Not today," she whispered. though she wasn't sure to whom she was speaking. When Fenwick arrived an hour later, boots splashing through the mud as he hurried to the porch, Nora met him with tension stamped across her face. Fenwick's khaki jacket was soaked at the shoulders, and raindrops clung to the ends of his ponytail. His expression, usually calm and controlled, turned sharp when he saw her. "What happened?" he asked, breath fogging in the damp air. "There's a truck," Nora said, "down the hill. It hasn't moved since midday." Fenwick stepped inside, wiping his glasses with the corner of his sleeve. "Describe it." "Dark, black or deep gray, older model, big tires, lifted frame." Fenwick's jaw tightened. "That matches the type used by men who work the freight pier." His voice dropped. "And by men who run the kind of operation we're worried about." He walked over to Solace, kneeling like before, but this time his brows creased with a deeper concern. "Before I came up, I checked in with a Marine patrol officer I trust. She told me someone filed a loose dog report 2 nights ago near Mariner's Edge Lighthouse." Nora blinked, surprised. "The abandoned one?" "Yes, according to her, the dog was described as a thin German shepherd with tattered ears." Nora inhaled sharply. "Solace." Fenwick nodded. "There have been rumors that Garrison Locke, you've heard the name, has been using the lighthouse grounds as a temporary training spot, out of sight, easy access to the water. Hunters in the area have reported hearing dogs crying at night." Garrison Locke was a name whispered in Clearwater's coastal bars and back-alley bait shops, a man in his early 50s with a reputation that clung to him like diesel smoke. He was tall, broad, with a shaved head and a jagged scar across his left cheek. Earned, rumor claimed, in a dogfight he initiated. Locke traded in rare breeds, selling them to private buyers with more money than conscience. He trained dogs with brutality, believing pain created control. Sheriff reports over the years had been inconclusive, his operation always slipping through legal cracks like oil through fingers. Fenwick continued, "If Solace escaped from there with Hallow, then Locke may be looking for them." At the word "escaped," Solace jerked awake, lifting her head sharply. Her amber eyes widened and she emitted a low growl, deep and trembling. Nora crossed to the window again, testing the sightline to the road. The truck was still there, silent, watching. "We need evidence," Nora murmured, half to herself. "If Locke is after her, we need proof of what he did. Otherwise, the law won't do a damn thing." Fenwick studied her for a long moment. "Nora, this could get dangerous. Locke has a temper, and he doesn't like losing what he considers property." "Solace isn't property." Nora's voice was low but fierce. She reached for her phone. "I'm calling Sheriff Boone." Sheriff Aldrich Boone was a man carved from New England grit, mid-50s, thick gray beard, and a body shaped like a granite wall. Years of policing had etched permanent lines across his brow. He answered Nora's call on the second ring, his voice gravelly yet steady. When Nora explained everything, the truck, the scars, Fenwick's findings, Boone let out a long exhale. "I've tried taking Locke down 4 times, he admitted. "Every time I get close, his people move the animals before I can secure a warrant." "What do we do now?" Nora asked. "Keep the dogs hidden. I'll send a patrol car to sweep the area tonight." "And Nora?" Boone paused, voice dropping. "Don't confront anyone alone." As evening crept in, Nora checked the window once more. The truck was gone. The road was empty, washed clean by rain, but the unease inside her lingered, settling deep beneath her ribs like a warning. The next morning dawned startlingly clear, the kind of cold, bright day that felt almost dishonest after a week of fog and rain. The sun rose in a pale arc over Clearwater Bay, lighting the rooftops of the small town like brushed steel. Nora stood on the courthouse steps with Solace pressed close to her right leg and Hallow held gently in her arms, wrapped in a thick, knitted blanket. Her breath formed small white clouds as she exhaled, though nerves, not weather, made her chest tight. Town Hall in Clearwater was a squat brick building from the early 1900s, its white-framed windows gleaming in the winter sun. Inside, voices murmured, reporters from the local paper, a few townspeople curious about the hearing, and staff from the sheriff's department. Nora pulled her jacket tighter. Solace, now a little stronger, kept scanning the parking lot, her body held low with instinctive caution. She had gained a bit of weight, and though her coat was still dull in places where scars cut across the fur, her stance today was different, protective, alert, ready. Hallow whimpered once, and Nora soothed him with slow circles of her thumb. As Nora entered the building, she immediately spotted Garrison Locke standing near the front table with his attorney. If the man looked intimidating from a distance, he was even more unsettling up close. Today he wore a dark wool coat over a charcoal sweater, the combination neat but unable to hide the raw brutality etched into the planes of his face. His bald head gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the jagged scar that crossed from his cheekbone to the corner of his mouth pulled his expression into something permanently skewed toward disdain. His eyes, pale gray, icy, fell on Solace and narrowed. Beside him stood his lawyer, Marvin Ketteridge, a thin man in his mid-40s with narrow shoulders, slicked-back blonde hair, and eyes that darted nervously behind a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. His suit was too expensive for Clearwater, tailored sharply enough to suggest he was hired from out of town. Marvin had a reputation for aggression in the courtroom, masked by polite speech, someone who used charm like a blade. When the clerk called the hearing to order, Nora took her seat beside Solace, who lay at her feet but kept her gaze fixed on Locke. Sheriff Aldrich Boone entered moments later, his heavy boots echoing in the chamber. Boone looked even more formidable indoors, broad-shouldered, thick beard trimmed short, his uniform stretched across a torso built like quarried stone. Deep lines framed his eyes, the kind carved by years of dealing with criminals who slipped through the cracks. Boone gave Nora a brief nod before standing near the back. The judge presiding today was Judge Miriam Halloway, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked black hair twisted into a tight bun. She had a reputation for fairness but also for strict adherence to evidence. Her rulings were rarely emotional, always precise. Her dark eyes scanned the room with the practiced calm of someone who had weathered decades of disputes. "Mr. Locke," Judge Halloway began, "you have filed a petition requesting the return of a German Shepherd female and her pup. Animals you claim are your legal property." Garrison Locke stepped forward. His voice was low, gravelly, and carried a false politeness that scraped against Nora's nerves. "Yes, Your Honor. My dogs were taken from my facility. I am here to retrieve what belongs to me." The word belongs made Solace stiffen. Nora reached down, brushing her fingertips along the dog's shoulder. Solace trembled. When it was her turn to speak, Nora stood, placing Hallow, still sleeping, into a padded basket Fenwick had provided earlier. She spoke slowly, clearly, recounting the events. The fog-covered bridge, Solace dragging her toward the trapped puppy, the wounds uncovered once they were safely home. She described the circular burns, the chain scars, the old fractures that should have healed cleanly, but had not. Judge Halloway listened without interruption. Marvin Ketteridge, however, leaned forward with an exaggerated sigh. "With all respect, Your Honor, this woman has no medical qualification. Her observations are simply emotional interpretations." Before Nora could respond, Fenwick Hale rose from his seat. Today he wore a clean white button-down shirt beneath a tweed coat, though his hair, still damp from the morning, looked slightly disheveled, suggesting he'd rushed here without finishing his coffee. Fenwick's voice, usually gentle, grew sharp as he addressed the court. "I examined both dogs personally. The injuries are consistent with long-term abuse. These are not accidental wounds." Marvin countered with smooth, rehearsed lines about lack of documentation, about Solace possibly being injured in the wild. Locke folded his arms, letting his attorney do the work, but his cold stare remained pinned on Solace like a predator reclaiming prey. For a terrible moment, Nora sensed the tide turning in Locke's favor. Judge Holloway's face remained unreadable, her gaze dropping to the papers before her. Then the courtroom doors burst open. Sheriff Boone strode down the aisle, a USB drive pinched between his fingers. "Your Honor," he said, voice booming through the chamber, "new evidence has come into my possession this morning." Behind him stepped Derek Lang, a fisherman in his early 50s with sun-baked skin, a bushy salt and pepper beard, and a posture that suggested decades of hauling nets. Derek held his weathered hat in both hands, twisting the brim nervously. "Found it near the rocks by Mariner's Edge Lighthouse," he said, nodding toward the USB. "Didn't know what was on it until I showed the sheriff." Judge Holloway allowed Boone to present the footage. As the screen flickered to life, the entire room fell into an unnatural stillness. The video showed dogs, many dogs, inside a fenced yard behind the lighthouse. Garrison Locke appeared in the frame multiple times, wielding a stun device, striking dogs that whimpered or lagged. He dragged one by a chain. He kicked another. The camera angle shifted, shaky, as if recorded by someone hiding in the rocks. Near the end of the footage appeared a thin female shepherd, ears torn, ribs showing, trembling violently. Solace. A sharp gasp rippled across the courtroom. Marvin Ketteridge's polished confidence collapsed instantly. Locke lunged forward, face flushed with rage, but deputies restrained him, slapping cuffs onto his wrists. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the commotion, firm as steel. "Effective immediately, Garrison Locke is remanded to county custody, pending full trial on charges of animal cruelty and illegal breeding operations. The German shepherd Solace and her pup Hallow will be placed in full protective guardianship under Ms. Nora Winslow." Nora exhaled, a long, shaking breath that felt like it carried months of heaviness with it. Solace pressed her head against Nora's leg. Hallow stirred softly in his basket. For the first time in a long time, victory didn't feel distant. It felt real. The evening sky over Clearwater Bay glowed with a warm, amber light, the kind that settled gently over the ocean, as if trying to soothe every wound the world had inflicted. The sea lay still beneath the cliff, shimmering with gold and rose-tinted reflections that softened the rugged coastline. A month had passed since the hearing, 30 quiet days marked by healing, small victories, and the emergence of something Nora had not felt in years: peace. Windbreak Point looked different now. The once lonely cedar cabin had taken on a new warmth, as though the presence of living souls had breathed fresh life into its timbers. Curtains Nora hadn't touched in years were now drawn open to welcome the sun. The yard, once overgrown, had been cleared just enough to create a soft patch of grass on the cliff's edge, where Solace and Hallow played daily. Solace, once gaunt and hollow-eyed, now stood proud and steady, her coat fuller, her posture stronger. She was still lean, but with a healthy sleekness rather than the desperate thinness she'd carried when Nora first found her. Scars remained, of course, pale lines that wound across her flank and legs, but they no longer defined her. Her amber eyes, once dulled by fear, now glowed with calm intelligence and deep, unwavering loyalty. Hallow had grown even more dramatically. The tiny, trembling pup Nora had held to her chest at the bridge now bounded across the yard with oversized paws and clumsy enthusiasm. His fur had darkened into a rich mix of black and russet, and a stripe of lighter brown streaked down his nose. His ears, still a little floppy at the tips, perked eagerly whenever Nora called his name. Hallow possessed a spark Solace never had the chance to keep, a spark of innocence, unbroken and unscarred. Nora sat on the worn wooden steps of the cabin, the ocean breeze lifting wisps of her chestnut hair. She looked different now, too. A month of steady sleep and purpose had softened her face, smoothing the shadows beneath her gray-blue eyes. She no longer moved like someone expecting pain at every turn. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, a woman rediscovering the parts of herself she once believed were buried with Elias and Rowan. A vehicle door shut softly behind her. Nora turned to see Sheriff Aldrich Boone walking up the path. He had removed his heavy uniform jacket, now wearing a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His thick beard looked recently trimmed, though strands of silver caught the last light of day. Boone always carried his massive frame with a certain restraint, as if afraid to take up too much space. But today he walked with an easy, almost relieved gait. "Brought the paperwork," Boone said, raising a folder, "all finalized." Nora stood, brushing grass from her jeans. "That fast?" Boone gave a half smile. "Judge Holloway expedited it. Said she'd never seen a dog so determined to choose its person." Solace trotted over, tail moving in slow sways. Boone bent, giving her a gentle scratch behind the ear. "And you," he muttered fondly, "you're the bravest girl I've ever seen." Behind them, Fenwick Hale appeared from around the side of the cabin, carrying a small brown paper package. He wore his usual worn jacket and black boots, though his glasses were new, rectangular frames that softened his sharp features. Fenwick had been visiting every few days, monitoring Hollow's growth, Solace's recovery, and Nora's mental return to the world beyond grief. Though he was not overly emotional, his affection for the animals was unmistakable, especially when he adjusted Hollow's bandages or murmured reassurance into Solace's ear. "Brought something," Fenwick said, handing Nora the package. Inside lay 2 leather collars, simple, sturdy, and beautifully crafted. Nora's breath caught when she read the engravings. Solace, free at last. Hollow, born safe, born loved. Nora swallowed hard, emotion tightening her chest. "Fenwick, these are perfect." He shrugged in his quiet, awkward way. "They've earned them." Solace approached first, lowering her head with solemn dignity. Nora knelt, fastening the collar gently around the healed skin of her neck. Solace pressed her forehead to Nora's chest, a gesture that had become their silent promise to one another. Hollow hopped forward, tail wagging wildly. Nora laughed, a full, unguarded sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, and fitted his collar while he wriggled with impatient joy. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of fire and gold, Nora walked with Solace and Hollow to the cliff's edge. The wind lifted the ends of her hair, carried the scent of salt and cedar, and brushed warm against her face. Solace leaned her weight gently against Nora's hip, a gesture full of trust. Hollow flopped down at her feet, his head resting on her boot, gazing up with boundless devotion. Nora wrapped her arms around both. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment sink deep into her bones. She had saved them, but somehow they had saved her first. She thought of Elias and Rowan, of the crushing grief that had once made this home feel like a tomb. She thought of the cold, fog-swathed bridge where fate had placed solace in her path, and she realized something simple, something profound. Saving a life had returned her own. As the final rays of sunlight shimmered across the still water, Solace rested her head against Nora's shoulder. Hollow sighed contentedly at her feet. On the wind-carved cliff overlooking the silent sea, a new family, one born from pain, courage, and the thin, flickering thread of hope, found its place in the world. In the quiet glow of that final sunset over Windbreak Point, one truth rose gently above everything Nora had endured. Sometimes God sends his miracles in forms we don't expect. Not in thunder, not in fire, but wrapped in fur, carrying scars, and asking quietly for a chance to be loved. Solace and Hollow were not just 2 dogs rescued from darkness. They were reminders, sacred whispers from above, that no heart is too wounded to heal, no past is too broken to redeem, and no life is too lost for God to guide back into the light. In our own lives, we face days when grief feels heavy, when loneliness sits beside us at the table, when we wonder if God is still listening. But then, in the smallest moments, a loyal dog resting its head on our knee, a neighbor offering kindness, a call from someone who still cares. That's where His grace shows up. Quiet, patient, faithful, just like Solace, who carried hope through pain, just like Nora, who opened her heart again after loss, just like each of us, trying every day to choose love over fear. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that miracles still walk among us, if you think every creature deserves a chance at safety and love,